My name is Jenny Rodriguez, and for 8 years, I served as Senior Director of Clinical Trial Oversight at one of the most promising biotech companies on the East Coast. I thought I was building something meaningful, helping bring life-saving treatments to patients who desperately needed them. What I didn't expect was to become the canary in the coal mine for corporate greed. I'd started at Riverbridge fresh out of my postdoc at Johns Hopkins, where I'd specialized in cardiovascular pharmacology. Back then, the company felt like a family. We were housed in a converted warehouse in Cambridge, with exposed brick walls covered in whiteboards filled with molecular structures and treatment protocols. The coffee was terrible, but the passion was infectious. Dr. Helena Vasquez, our founder and CEO, used to walk the halls with rolled-up sleeves, stopping at every workstation to ask about progress, challenges, obstacles. She knew every employee's name, their kids' ages, their spouse's profession. "We're not just developing drugs," she'd say during our monthly all-hands meetings, "we're developing hope." Those early days felt magical. Our first successful compound, RB47, showed remarkable promise in treating a rare form of childhood leukemia. I remember the day we got our first breakthrough therapy designation from the FDA. Helena actually cried during the announcement, and there wasn't a dry eye in that cramped conference room. We were going to change the world, one careful, methodical trial at a time. Let me take you back to that Tuesday morning in March. The conference room smelled like stale coffee and anxiety as I sat across from VP of Operations, Robert Sterling. His expensive suit couldn't hide the impatience radiating from every gesture as he shuffled through my latest compliance report. By then, Riverbridge had changed dramatically. We'd gone public 3 years earlier, moved into a gleaming glass tower in downtown Boston, and Helena had been gradually pushed aside by a board of directors who spoke in quarterly projections rather than patient outcomes. Sterling represented everything I'd grown to despise about our corporate evolution, a Harvard MBA with dead eyes who'd never spent a day in actual pharmaceutical research but somehow felt qualified to override decades of combined scientific expertise. The report he was dismissing so carelessly represented 6 weeks of intensive analysis. I'd personally reviewed electrocardiograms from 847 trial participants across 12 clinical sites. The patterns were subtle but consistent, QT interval prolongations that appeared in roughly 3.2% of patients receiving our new cardiac medication, RB203. In layman's terms, we were seeing early signs that the drug might be causing dangerous heart rhythm abnormalities. "Jenny, we need to talk about your thoroughness," he began, not bothering to look up from the documents. I'd been at Riverbridge long enough to recognize when someone was about to deliver bad news wrapped in corporate speak. My stomach tightened as I watched him set aside page after page of carefully documented safety concerns I'd flagged in our Phase 2 trials. "These reports of yours are becoming problematic," Sterling continued, finally meeting my eyes with a cold stare that made my skin crawl. "The board is concerned about timeline delays." Timeline delays. As if patient safety was nothing more than an inconvenient scheduling conflict. What Sterling didn't understand, or chose to ignore, was that RB203 represented a $2.8 billion market opportunity according to our consultants. It was designed to treat a specific type of heart failure that affected roughly 400,000 Americans, with current treatment options being both expensive and marginally effective. If successful, this drug would not only help hundreds of thousands of patients but also secure Riverbridge's financial future for decades. The pressure from investors had been relentless. During our last quarterly earnings call, I'd listened from my office as Sterling fielded increasingly aggressive questions about development timelines. When can we expect Phase 3 initiation? What's the projected FDA submission date? Are there any regulatory obstacles we should be concerned about? Each question felt like another weight added to an already precarious balance between scientific rigor and commercial pressure. "Robert, those aren't delays," I said, keeping my voice steady despite the anger building in my chest. "Those are necessary safety protocols. We've identified potential cardiac complications in 3% of trial participants. That's significant enough to warrant." "Speed, not perfection, is what matters," he interrupted, leaning back in his chair with that smug expression I'd grown to despise. "Too much time is wasted on details." The casual dismissal hit me like a physical blow. Details? We were talking about human lives, about families who trusted us with their loved ones' health. I could feel my professional composure beginning to crack. "These aren't details, Robert. These are people. Real people with real families who I thought about Mrs. Patterson again, the 67-year-old grandmother from our Worcester trial site. During her enrollment visit, she'd told me about her granddaughter's upcoming wedding, how she hoped the experimental treatment might give her enough energy to dance at the reception. "I've been dealing with this heart condition for 12 years, she'd said, gripping my hand with surprising strength. "If there's even a chance this could help, I want to be part of the solution for other people like me." That's what Sterling couldn't grasp. Every data point in my reports represented someone's mother, father, spouse, child. The QT prolongations I'd identified weren't just statistical anomalies, they were warning signs that we might be trading short-term symptom relief for long-term cardiac risk. "Who signed informed consent forms?" He cut me off again. "Look, Jenny, I appreciate your dedication. But the reality is that every day we delay costs this company millions. The investors are breathing down our necks, and frankly, your perfectionist approach is becoming a liability." The word liability hung in the air between us like poison gas. After 8 years of meticulous work, of nights spent poring over data to ensure every participant's safety, I was being labeled a liability for doing my job. "What exactly are you saying?" I asked, though part of me already knew. Sterling reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a manila envelope. The sight of it made my mouth go dry. "Effective immediately, you're being removed from clinical trial oversight. We're restructuring the department to be more efficient." The envelope contained my official termination letter, though they dressed it up with corporate euphemisms. Organizational restructuring, strategic realignment, operational optimization, a masterclass in sanitizing the fact that they were firing me for doing my job too well. What stung most was the implication that my perfectionist approach was somehow unreasonable. I'd spent 8 years building Riverbridge's reputation with regulatory agencies. Our FDA relationships were sterling because we never cut corners, never submitted sloppy data, never promised timelines we couldn't meet. The agency trusted us precisely because they knew Jenny Rodriguez wouldn't let anything slide through the cracks. I thought about the early morning phone calls I'd fielded from concerned investigators at clinical sites, the weekend hours I'd spent reviewing adverse event reports, the relationships I'd cultivated with cardiologists across the country who trusted Riverbridge because they trusted me. All of that institutional knowledge, those carefully maintained professional networks, Sterling was throwing it all away for the sake of accelerating a timeline that was already aggressive by industry standards. My hand shook as I stared at the envelope. 8 years of building protocols, of establishing relationships with regulatory bodies, of ensuring Riverbridge maintained the highest ethical standards, all of it reduced to a manila envelope and corporate efficiency. "You're making a mistake," I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. "Those cardiac markers aren't just statistical noise. If you push forward without addressing them, that's no longer your concern," Sterling replied, standing up to signal the end of our conversation. "Security will escort you to collect your personal items." The walk to my office felt surreal, like moving through thick fog. My colleagues avoided eye contact as I packed 8 years of my professional life into cardboard boxes. The framed photo of my daughter's graduation, the coffee mug from our successful Phase 1 celebration, the thank you cards from families whose lives had been changed by our careful work, all of it suddenly felt like artifacts from a different lifetime. The most painful part was watching my team's reaction. Dr. Amanda Wells, my deputy director, stood frozen in the doorway as I emptied my desk drawers. We'd worked together for 5 years, weathered 3 major FDA inspections, and developed protocols that had become industry best practices. Now she'd have to watch our department get dismantled by people who understood spreadsheets better than science. "Jenny, what do you want me to do about the Boston site concerns?" Amanda whispered, glancing nervously toward Sterling's office. "Document everything," I replied, sliding my backup drives into my laptop bag. "Every adverse event, every protocol deviation, every concern raised by investigators. Promise me you won't let them steamroll the safety monitoring." Amanda nodded, but I could see the fear in her eyes. She had 2 kids in private school and a mortgage in Newton. Speaking up might cost her everything, and we both knew it. Security escort protocol at Riverbridge was surprisingly gentle, no dramatic marching toward the exit like you see in movies. Instead, a soft-spoken guard named Carlos, whom I'd chatted with countless mornings in the elevator, quietly accompanied me to the parking garage. We discussed his son's baseball games and his wife's nursing school program over the years. Now he looked genuinely pained as he helped me load boxes into my Honda Civic. "This isn't right, Ms. Rodriguez," he said quietly, glancing around to make sure no executives were watching. "Everyone here knows you're one of the good ones." But I walked away calmly. What choice did I have? That night, I sat in my kitchen staring at my laptop screen, drafting and deleting emails to former colleagues at the FDA. How do you blow the whistle on a company that's already shown they don't care about your expertise? How do you protect people when you've been systematically stripped of your ability to do so? The hardest email to write was to Dr. Patricia Voss at the FDA's Office of Scientific Investigations. Patricia and I had worked together on 3 previous Riverbridge inspections, and she'd always praised our thoroughness and transparency. How do you tell a regulatory partner that the company they trusted is about to go rogue? I started typing, "Dear Patricia, I wanted to make you aware of some concerning developments at Riverbridge regarding the RB203 program." Then I deleted it. Then I started again, "Patricia, as someone who values our professional relationship, I feel obligated to share some observations about recent changes in Riverbridge's approach to safety monitoring." Delete. The legal implications terrified me. Riverbridge had made me sign a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement when I was promoted to senior director. Technically, sharing internal safety data could constitute a breach of contract, industrial espionage, or worse. But ethically, how could I stay silent when I knew people might die? My daughter Sophia called around 10 p.m. from her apartment in San Francisco, where she was working as a software engineer. She'd always been proud of my work in pharmaceuticals, often telling her friends how her mom helped develop medicines that saved lives. "How was your day, Mom?" she asked, and I realized I hadn't figured out how to explain what had happened. "Complicated," I finally said. "I might be looking for a new job soon." "Everything okay? You sound weird." I wanted to protect her from the mess I was navigating, but Sophia had inherited my sense of justice and would see right through any attempt to sugarcoat the situation. My company made some decisions I couldn't support. Sometimes doing the right thing costs you professionally. There was a long pause on the other end. Then, "Mom, you taught me that integrity isn't negotiable. Whatever happened, I'm proud of you for sticking to your principles." Her words gave me the strength I needed to finish the email to Patricia. Sleep didn't come easy. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those cardiac markers, those subtle but consistent patterns that Sterling had dismissed as perfectionist paranoia. I kept thinking about Mrs. Patterson, the 67-year-old grandmother from our Worcester trial site who'd hugged me after her 3-month checkup, tears in her eyes as she thanked me for giving her hope. But it wasn't just Mrs. Patterson keeping me awake. There was Mr. Gonzalez from the Miami site, a 54-year-old construction worker who'd enrolled in the trial because his insurance wouldn't cover the existing heart failure medications. He had 3 teenagers at home and worked 2 jobs to support them. "This is my shot at being around to see my kids graduate," he'd told me during his baseline visit. Then there was Sarah Kim, a 43-year-old marketing executive from Portland who'd been dealing with heart failure since a viral infection damaged her cardiac muscle 5 years earlier. She was planning her wedding and desperately wanted to be healthy enough to start a family. "Dr. Rodriguez," she'd said during our last phone call, "I know this is experimental, but you guys have such a good reputation. I trust you to keep me safe." The weight of that trust felt crushing now. These people had volunteered for our trial because they believed Riverbridge would prioritize their well-being over corporate profits. They'd signed informed consent forms, but those documents were based on the assumption that we'd maintain rigorous safety monitoring throughout the study. By removing me from oversight, Sterling had fundamentally altered the risk-benefit calculation that these participants had relied on when making their decision to enroll. 2 days later, I was watering plants in my home office when my phone exploded with calls. The first was from my former colleague, Sarah, her voice barely coherent through panicked breathing. "Jenny, thank God you answered. Have you seen the news? The FDA just..." Before she could finish, I heard commotion in the background, voices shouting over each other. Someone was yelling about stock prices, another voice demanded to know where the legal team was, and underneath it all was the sound of hurried footsteps on marble floors. "Sarah, what's happening?" "They're here. FDA investigators, DEA agents, someone from the Attorney General's office. They've got boxes of documents, and they're interviewing everyone. Security won't let anyone leave the building until they've been cleared." The line went dead. My hands were shaking as I rushed to my computer and pulled up the financial news. The headline made my blood run cold: "Riverbridge Pharma trading halted after FDA issues emergency stop order." Below that, federal investigators seized documents amid reports of trial participant death. The subheading was even worse: company stock plummets 67% in pre-market trading as regulators question safety protocols. I scrolled through the article, my heart pounding as the details emerged. The FDA had received credible reports of serious safety concerns related to RB203. Multiple trial sites had reported cardiac emergencies among participants, including one fatality at Massachusetts General Hospital. The victim's name wasn't released, but the article mentioned she was a 72-year-old retired educator who'd enrolled in the trial seeking better treatment options for her heart condition. My phone rang again. This time it was Marcus Webb, another former colleague from the trials division. "Jenny, it's chaos here. The FDA showed up with a full team. They're shutting down all trials immediately. Sterling is losing his mind, screaming at anyone who'll listen about." "About what?" I pressed, though I already suspected. "About the cardiac complications. Apparently, 2 participants in the Boston site went into arrhythmia yesterday. One of them, Jenny, one of them didn't make it." The room seemed to tilt around me. I gripped the edge of my desk as Marcus continued. "There are rumors that someone leaked internal documents to the regulators. Sterling is convinced it was industrial sabotage, but everyone who saw your reports knows better. They're specifically asking to interview you, Jenny. The investigators have copies of all your safety analyses from the past 6 months." After Marcus hung up, I sat in stunned silence. The patterns I'd identified, the warnings I'd tried to raise, the safety protocols Sterling had dismissed, they'd all come to pass exactly as I'd feared. But knowing I'd been right brought no satisfaction. Someone was dead. Eleanor Martinez, I learned her name from a later news report, had trusted us with her life, and we'd failed her. The guilt was overwhelming, even though I knew I'd done everything in my power to prevent exactly this outcome. The irony was bitter. If Sterling had listened to my concerns, we could have implemented additional cardiac monitoring, adjusted dosing protocols, or even paused enrollment to investigate the QT prolongation signals. Instead, his impatience had led to exactly the kind of regulatory crisis that biotech companies spend decades trying to avoid. Within hours, the financial news painted the full picture. Riverbridge's stock price had plummeted by 67%, wiping nearly $500 million off their market valuation. Trading remained suspended while federal investigators combed through years of clinical data. The company's carefully cultivated relationships with investment banks evaporated overnight, and several institutional investors announced they were divesting their positions entirely. The next morning brought the scene I'll never forget. Marcus called again, this time from the parking lot of Riverbridge headquarters. "You have to hear this, Jenny." Sterling just burst into the emergency board meeting, and I could hear him through the conference room door. He was screaming, "Why were regulators allowed to shut us down and wipe $500 million off our stock?" The irony was so thick you could cut it with a scalpel. The same man who dismissed my concerns about patient safety was now panicking about the financial consequences of ignoring those very same concerns. But here's what really gets me: in that moment of corporate crisis, Sterling's first instinct wasn't to express regret about the patient who'd died or concern for the others who'd been harmed. His immediate reaction was to blame others for not preventing the regulatory shutdown he'd essentially guaranteed with his reckless decisions. Marcus continued, "The board members were furious. I heard Johnson, the guy from Goldman who led our Series C, absolutely tearing into Sterling. You were warned about cardiac risks months ago. We have documentation showing your oversight director flagged these exact concerns. How do you explain removing her from the program just days before this catastrophe?" Apparently, the board had conducted their own investigation within hours of the FDA raid. They'd pulled my termination paperwork, reviewed my final safety reports, and interviewed several clinical site investigators who had raised concerns directly to corporate leadership. The timeline was damning. I'd identified significant cardiac safety signals, been fired for being too perfectionist, and then watched helplessly as those same signals manifested in exactly the adverse events I'd predicted. Sterling tried to claim it was about operational efficiency, Marcus said, but nobody was buying it. One of the board members, I think it was Dr. Williams from Merck, called it criminal negligence disguised as corporate optimization. The legal implications were staggering. Beyond the FDA's regulatory enforcement action, Riverbridge was facing potential criminal charges for knowingly endangering trial participants. The families of affected patients were already organizing class action lawsuits, and several state attorneys general had announced investigations into the company's trial practices. What made it worse was the ripple effect throughout the biotech community. Riverbridge had been considered a model company, our regulatory compliance record was spotless, our scientific publications were highly respected, and our clinical sites consistently received top ratings from the FDA. The scandal sent shockwaves through an industry that depends on public trust and regulatory cooperation. 3 weeks later, I received a call from federal investigators. They wanted to discuss my tenure in the clinical oversight department, particularly my final months before being removed from the position. During that 4-hour interview, I learned that my carefully documented reports, the ones Sterling had dismissed as perfectionist paranoia, had become key evidence in the FDA's enforcement action. The investigator, a sharp-eyed woman named Dr. Patricia Voss, told me something that still gives me chills. Your documentation saved lives, Ms. Rodriguez. Without those detailed safety protocols and risk assessments, we might not have caught this pattern until dozens more people were hurt. Patricia explained that my final report had been forwarded to the FDA through channels I hadn't even known existed. Dr. Amanda Wells, my former deputy, had quietly shared my safety analyses with the agency after witnessing Sterling's increasingly reckless approach to trial management. Amanda had risked her own career to ensure that my concerns reached the right people, and her courage had ultimately prevented a much larger catastrophe. We estimate that your early warning system prevented approximately 200 additional patients from being exposed to dangerous cardiac risks, Patricia continued. The QT prolongation patterns you identified were subtle but clinically significant. Most oversight directors wouldn't have caught them until much later in the development process. The interview also revealed the broader scope of Riverbridge's corporate dysfunction. Sterling had been systematically undermining safety protocols across multiple programs, not just RB203. He pressured clinical site investigators to downplay adverse events, delayed reporting of serious safety issues to regulatory authorities, and even attempted to exclude patients with concerning cardiac findings from safety analyses. My removal had been part of a larger strategy to eliminate what he called regulatory roadblocks throughout the organization. What shocked me most was learning about the internal communications that investigators had uncovered during their raid. Email chains between Sterling and other executives revealed a deliberate strategy to minimize safety reporting in order to maintain aggressive development timelines. One particularly damning message from Sterling to the head of regulatory affairs read, "We can't let perfectionist safety monitoring derail our market opportunity." Rodriguez's approach is unsustainable for a competitive biotech environment. The financial investigation was equally revealing. Riverbridge's board had been pressured by investors to demonstrate rapid progress toward regulatory approval, with Sterling promising milestones that were unrealistic given proper safety oversight requirements. The company had committed to initiating Phase 3 trials by Q3, a timeline that was only achievable by cutting corners on safety monitoring and regulatory compliance. Looking back now, I realize that being removed from my position wasn't the end of my story, it was actually the beginning of understanding my real purpose in this industry. Sometimes protecting people means being willing to be labeled a liability by those who prioritize profits over human lives. The months following the Riverbridge scandal were challenging in ways I hadn't anticipated. While I was vindicated professionally, the emotional toll was enormous. I struggled with survivor's guilt. Why had I been the one to spot the cardiac risks while other qualified scientists missed them? Was there something I could have done differently to prevent Eleanor Martinez's death? These questions haunted me during long nights when sleep wouldn't come. The biotech community's response was mixed. Some colleagues reached out to offer support and job opportunities, recognizing that my actions had upheld the industry's ethical standards. But others seemed to view me as a troublemaker who destroyed a promising company. I received several job rejections that felt suspiciously related to my whistleblower status, though no one would say so explicitly. The legal proceedings dragged on for months. I testified before federal investigators, participated in depositions for multiple lawsuits, and endured intense scrutiny from Riverbridge's legal team, who attempted to portray me as a disgruntled employee seeking revenge against the company. The stress was overwhelming, but Patricia Voss and her team provided consistent support throughout the process. One particularly difficult moment came during Eleanor Martinez's family's wrongful death lawsuit. I had to sit across from her daughter, Maria, and explain in clinical terms how her mother's cardiac arrest might have been prevented with proper safety monitoring. Maria was remarkably gracious, thanking me for trying to protect her mother despite the corporate pressure I'd faced. But seeing her grief up close reinforced the human cost of Sterling's reckless decisions. Today, I work as an independent clinical safety consultant, helping smaller biotech companies build robust oversight systems from the ground up. The pay isn't as good as my Riverbridge salary, but I sleep better at night knowing that the systems I design put patient welfare first. My consulting practice has grown organically through referrals from FDA investigators, clinical site directors, and other professionals who witnessed the Riverbridge disaster. Companies hire me specifically because of my reputation for uncompromising safety standards. They understand that thorough oversight might slow down development timelines, but it also prevents the kind of catastrophic failures that can destroy a company overnight. One of my first clients was a small oncology company developing treatments for rare pediatric cancers. The CEO, Dr. Rachel Morrison, had watched the Riverbridge scandal unfold and realized her own company was making some of the same mistakes Sterling had made, prioritizing speed over safety, minimizing adverse event reporting, and viewing regulatory compliance as an obstacle rather than a partnership. "We need someone who won't tell us what we want to hear," Dr. Morrison told me during our initial consultation. "We need someone who'll protect us from ourselves." Working with smaller companies has been incredibly rewarding. These entrepreneurs are often brilliant scientists with groundbreaking ideas, but they lack experience in clinical development and regulatory affairs. By implementing rigorous safety monitoring from the very beginning of their programs, we can identify potential issues early and address them proactively rather than reactively. I've also become an advocate for regulatory reform. The current system places enormous pressure on companies to demonstrate rapid progress to investors, creating incentives for the kind of corner-cutting that led to the Riverbridge disaster. I've testified before congressional committees, spoken at industry conferences, and written articles for medical journals about the need for better alignment between financial incentives and patient safety. My relationship with the FDA has evolved as well. Patricia Voss and I now collaborate on training programs for new investigators, helping them recognize the warning signs of companies that might be compromising safety for commercial gain. These programs have become increasingly popular as the agency works to prevent future disasters like the one at Riverbridge. Sterling? He was quietly let go 6 months after the FDA shutdown, though he received a severance package that would make your head spin. Riverbridge eventually resumed limited operations under new leadership, but they never recovered their pre-scandal market position. The patient who died was named Eleanor Martinez. She was a 72-year-old retired teacher who'd volunteered for our trial because she wanted to help advance medical science. She left behind 3 children and 7 grandchildren who trusted that we would keep her safe. I think about Eleanor every day. Not with guilt, I did everything in my power to protect her and others like her, but with renewed determination to ensure that corporate convenience never again trumps human dignity in the medical research I oversee.